My name is Warren Block. I've been using FreeBSD since before '98. Started with FreeBSD version 4. In 2011, I became a FreeBSD Documentation committer. And in 2014, I joined the mysterious and misunderstood document engineering team. The document engineering team, our charter is to keep the documentation build tools and system and files working. That's it. At present, that's the whole charter of the team, to keep that system working and usable. And what we're going to talk about is translation and how it's used with FreeBSD documentation and what we can do to encourage that. And the first thing here is it can be reasonably asked, well, maybe we don't have the resources to even do translation. There are some projects that have said, and I don't want to point fingers, but it's a valid choice for them. They have said, we're just going to do English-only documents. And I might be biased. Well, I am biased. I think that there's... Nobody held their hand up. Did you hear me say there? If I say or yeah, hold your hand up and remind me. I think there's a tremendous value that FreeBSD can offer to people, and it's bad to limit that to English only. Not only can those people benefit from it, but FreeBSD itself can benefit from more users. And part of that is that translators are often your ambassadors, the first ambassadors to a country. Drew remembers where I picked this up. It was at Open Help. I can't remember his name. Okay, thank you. It's good for that participation. Translators are your first ambassadors for a project into a new country. Frequently, they're the users. They start out using it because they speak English and their language, and they want to allow other people in their country to use it. Maybe just employees, maybe people they work with, or maybe they want to spread that project. And if we can improve the situation for translators, if we can make that job easier, we can improve the usage of FreeBSD. And the reason, I should use my laser pointer here, because it's cool. The reason we want to enlarge the community is Metcalfe's Law. Hold your hand up if you know what Metcalfe's Law is. Nobody? All right, you might know it by a different name or not know it by a name. Metcalfe's Law says, in a paraphrase form, the value of a telecommunications network is proportional to the number of nodes. And all that's saying is the bigger a network, the more useful it is. And what is a telecommunication, or what is FreeBSD except a large telecommunications project where the users are the nodes? So more users contribute, they find bugs, they contribute patches, they test, they add documentation, and that improves FreeBSD, which in turn makes it better for them. So you have a feedback loop. That, I say, is the value of translation. So, when we talk about the FreeBSD documentation, it is not just one thing. There are actually several components. The books and articles, I almost said there, but I kind of think I got away with it. The books and articles, like the famous FreeBSD handbook, are marked up with DocBook XML. And because of XML, we have the XML toolchain. XML lint, XSLT proc, XSL style sheets, FOB. And from that marked up original, we can generate, that was an From that marked up original, we can generate various output formats. HTML, that was an HTML, which most people have seen on the website, the HTML version of the handbook or the Porter's handbook or the other documents. Or PDF or EPUB or any of a number of other formats. We also, though, have man pages. Man pages use the MDoc markup language, which is entirely unrelated to DocBook. DocBook is intimidating for some people, reasonably enough. MDoc is intimidating for some people, and there's practically no overlap. You can be an expert in one and have no idea how to use the other. But the man pages also fall under the auspices of the FreeBSD Documentation project. As a documentation committer, we are allowed to go into source files and fix misspellings or unclear wording in not just man pages, but also source files or text files. So that is the second portion of the FreeBSD documentation. And I personally, and I think many FreeBSD users and many BSD users, really regard the man pages as a big feature. It's not a tutorial, they're not meant to be a tutorial. It's a short reference on the commands and options, and of course, we've taken that farther. It's a reference on files and directory layout, techniques even. So we really like our man pages. We regard them as a big feature. And we have other things. The FreeBSD website, regardless of what you think of it, the design of it, that falls under the FreeBSD documentation project. The website is mostly generated from XML files using XSL style sheets. There is some raw handwritten HTML in there. There are Perl CGI scripts. There are a number of other things. And we've talked about adding newer markup languages like restructured text or Markdown or ASCII doc. Although we haven't done it yet, we might do that. So that is the FreeBSD documentation. And before we talk about the translation, we'll talk about Whitespace. Whitespace, of course, is what we call invisible spaces between characters. Spaces, tabs, character turns, line feeds. There are some other weird characters that can be in there, but these are the ones we usually see. And it seems like a simple thing, but it's a real problem for us because we explain it to people and we say, okay, see that thing you can't see? What? That thing, that invisible thing that's between there. That invisible space between those letters. Okay, that's a space. No, it's actually a tab. No, it's actually could be a space and a tab and another space. It's difficult to explain because most of the time people can't see it. And I can prove this. Some editors will show you, like Vim. Vim will show you the dot, the raised dot instead of a space, so the spaces become visible. But I turned on syntax highlighting in my editor to show me spaces at the end of a line or a space before a tab, which makes no sense. And if you go and look at source files, you will find those everywhere. A blank line with spaces on it. And in a normal editor, that's invisible. All right, and you might say, fairly enough, okay, who cares? I mean, it's a space. But for translators, translators watch diffs, changes to the English file. So I come in and I say, you know, there should be one space there instead of two spaces. And I remove that extra space. And they see a diff for that entire line. And they work hard. And so they say, well, here's a change I have to translate. But none of the words changed. They're wasting their time. And it's not that we do this, sorry. It's not that we do this on purpose. It's a problem that we have to try and overcome. And in fact, it's a problem for people working on the English documents also because we can't just see a problem with spaces and fix it, or we can't edit something and fix the spaces around it. We have to change content, the words, separately from the spaces so that translators only see the content changes. So this change is one that you do have to retranslate. This is all just rewrapping paragraphs and adding or deleting spaces or blank lines, so you can ignore it. The content didn't change. But as writers, we have to separate those. So the way it's supposed to work is I go through and I fix the content. There's a spelling change here, I reorder a sentence here, I fix a few things. And now the lines are too long, some lines are too long so I can't see them all on the editor screen, and some are too short, but I can't touch that. So I commit that change, the translators see that, they translate, and now I go back and I can do whitespace changes, but only whitespace changes. So I go through and I'm rewrapping paragraphs and fixing spaces and stuff, and I see a misspelling. Can't fix it. That's a content change. So I fix all the spaces, making notes of any other errors I find, and commit the whitespace only change with a note to translators that says, this is not a content change, this is whitespace only, you can ignore it. And now I have a third commit to do to fix the errors I found while I was fixing Whitespace. So it's a problem. It's a serious problem for everybody. All right. Finally, we'll talk about the old translation method. Before that, I want to drink a little of this thing. I think it's tea. Could be. The old translation method, which has been around for, I don't know, 15 years at least, possibly 20, possibly from the start. It's simple enough to describe, which is that translators work by commits, which I talked about a little bit ago. They see the changes that have been made to the English original documents, and they translate those into their translated version. They do this manually. There's no systems, nothing. You might have things like spelling checkers, but there's nothing more than that. They must go in order. A small change is made to the handbook, they have to do that one. A bigger change is made, they have to do those in the order they occurred to the English document. And this is not a huge problem with documentation until you get to something like, oh, here's an urgent change that people really should be reading about, but it's 100 commits down. They have to do that 100 before, because that change depends on all the previous ones. They also must work by size. Commits vary in size. It might be a simple spelling fix. It might be a rewrite of a paragraph. It might be a rewrite of a chapter. The translator doesn't really get a choice. It's like, okay, you're going to translate this. You have to do pretty much the whole commit. And if you're lucky, it'll be a little one. If you're unlucky, it'll be a big one. And the rest of your translation team is waiting because they can't do anything until that one is committed. They can't continue on. So, well, let's look at it in a little more detail. This is going to be hard to see. I'm sorry about that. It's just the projector. But I will give you the details. And if you want, in this beautiful FreeBSD Con proceedings, not this one, a couple of these screenshots are in that article, which is in here somewhere. It's beautiful, it really is. I'm impressed by that. This is a copy of the German translation of a section, the X11 section of the handbook. And this is how the German translators, you correct me if I'm wrong here, I think I've got it reasonably right. At the top of the file, the translators put a comment that has the revision number that is the last one they've translated. That's how they tell how up to date this file is. Purely manual. And I thought this one would be a little better, but I was expecting it to not be very readable for people. I will summarize it for you. The reason it has a small font like that is because I wanted to show a real commit. This is a real commit. This is the next, well, let me explain. It's one command at the top and then a bunch of output. And that command at the top is a fairly involved version control command where the translator says, show me the next commit, the next change to this file that I have to translate. And it's kind of a gamble. Like I say, it might be one line, it might be 1,000. So this is the actual output of that. And the takeaway from this is that it's a fairly involved command. You can kind of do it by rote, but this is something that translators using the old system have to learn. And then it shows, of course, a normal BIF, which is what changes occurred to the English file. So this is what they have to translate and integrate with, in this case, the German section. And at this point, the translator often might say, well, how many more of these are there to go until I've got it up to date? And so they need another fairly involved command. So again, they need some knowledge of the version control system. And this is just a list of the commits. In this case, it's 5 of them. There's no way to tell, though, how bad they are. Some of those might be Whitespace only commits, where the translator can say, nothing to do. Some of them might be chapter rewrites. Okay, now this one is in the proceedings book, but we don't really need to talk about that. This is the same thing. This is the English current version of the handbook XOR configuration section, and this is the German translation. And even though you probably can't read the words, you will see that these sections don't line up. There is no one-to-one correspondence between a sentence in English and a sentence in German. And remember that the German version is being brought up to date, so it's missing things. So at some point, the translator is going to end up looking at two editors like this and try and find the part in their translated version that needs the new translated changes. How do you do it? It's purely manual. It's all up to the translator. At some conferences, we didn't do it this time, but at like BSD can, we hold the Doc Lounge at night. And the Doc Lounge is like the Hacker Lounge, where we invite people to come in and we will work with them one-on-one on documentation issues, whatever they want to work on. And frequently people will show up and say, hey, I don't know so much about the technical side, but I can translate. How can I start translating the FreeBSD documentation? And we say, well, we have a book called the FreeBSD Documentation Primer. It talks about DocBook XML. You kind of need to know that, a lot of it. It talks about our formatting rules because we say we want lines wrapped in a certain way so that it keeps them all visible on the screen. You need to know that. You need to know the version control system because you need to be able to say what's the next commit I have to work on for translating. And there are probably one or two other things. And as I get done explaining this, I turn around and the potential translator is no longer there. They have gone somewhere else, which is not, I understand that. I understand that completely. It's like, hey, I'd like to be able to help. Okay, first you need to go through this book of rules and learn it all. That's not conducive to translation. So, let's talk about the new translation method. While I take another drink of this mystery tea. It's based on Gettext. Just as a quick overview, Gettext is a program that was developed for application programs so that you wouldn't have to recompile an application program to get the output in a different language. You have a bunch of translated strings, the user sets their locale, Gettext looks it up, and suddenly the program is in that language. All the prompts and string, menu things. I said no there, and I said it again. That system, the Gettext system, has been sort of repurposed to be used with documentation. It's not exactly the same, because strings in programs are usually pretty short, you know, file, print, and that kind of thing. Documentation is paragraphs and sentences and chapters, so it's not exactly a good way to do it, or it wouldn't seem so, except it works actually pretty well, surprisingly well. And the way that works is a program looks at the English original file, in this case an XML file, it extracts the translatable strings from that into a PO file, which stands for Portable Object. The translator uses a PO editor to enter their translations. There's an English string and a translated string, one-to-one correspondence. There is no looking things up. Whitespace is largely not an issue because that's handled by the program that's extracting the XML, the strings from the XML file. It can be a problem still, but it's not nearly as big a problem. And then there's finally a feature called translation memory. If you translate a string, let me back up. You're a translator. You translate a string once, and a string could be one word, or it could be a sentence, or it could be a paragraph. The PO editor can remember that translation, and when that occurs later in a new translation, it can offer to substitute that string back in. Now that sounds really good or really bad, depending on how you look at it. Because if you translate one word, and then that word is used in a sentence, and the PO editor just stuffs it in there, it probably won't be the right tense or plural, or it's not necessarily the same. But the way that works is by exact string matches, so it's not neither as bad nor as good as you might imagine. So, the PO translation process, this is it. All of it. There are 4 lines there. One of them is an output line. There are 3 commands. That's it. And I understand you probably can't see it, so I will say these. The first command is make PO. That extracts the strings from the English file and generates a PO file. If the PO file already exists, it will be merged so that only the new strings that have been added to the English file need to be translated again. And that output line just tells a few little details about that. Then the translator runs a PO editor. There are several. We will show PO edit here. And they enter their translated strings. Unlike the old method where you have to work in commit order, this is just string by string. You don't have to, if there's a certain section you want to work on, you can go work on that. You don't have to translate everything in a commit. It completely releases that. Yes?
You see that make PO merge from the original PO file into the translated PO file. Okay?
Okay.
And how can we check which line changed the original English line?
Okay, and I'm going to repeat what I think the question is. If your PO file already exists with some translations in it, and you run make PO again, it finds it, it uses message merge from the PO Gettext tools to merge that in. The newer strings will be added. Any old strings that are no longer found in the document will be commented out at the bottom of the PO file and can be removed manually or automatically. Any strings that are the same will still be in there. So that merge really just brings in the strings that don't already have a translation. So if I edit the Xorg configuration section of the handbook in English, and then you run make PO again, all the strings that were already translated are still there. Any new strings that have not yet been translated will show, it'll show the English string and the translated part of it will just be blank. Does that help any? Does that explain? It will not, it is based on string matches. It's not based on date.
How about the already translated?
It depends, well, I shouldn't say line. String is the right term because sometimes it'll be just a single word. The old lines will remain as they are. If they're no longer in the English original, they'll be commented out. They'll still be in the PO file. I'm not sure if I answered your question there. It works, I think. I'm reasonably sure it works. So, this diagram is also in that book. And this example is a Spanish translation of the leap seconds article. Here is the English strings, here are the English strings, here is the Spanish translation of those strings. It's a one-to-one correspondence. The translator doesn't have to look up where the string occurs. They don't have to search for that. They are not limited by the order of commit or the size of commit. Oh, and I should explain this a little better. This is the current line that the translator is working on, and here you see the full English string, and here's the full Spanish string. There's a one-to-one correspondence. You don't have to deal with commits. Another thing, which you probably couldn't see because it's hard to see detail on this projector, most of the XML tags are not visible in here. Structural tags like para or section, those are all handled by the extraction tool. The translator doesn't need to mess with them. So they need a little understanding of DocBook XML. If a DocBook tag occurs, like here's an acronym tag, acronym POSIX, and that needs to also occur in the translated version. But it's so much easier. It's so much quicker. Oh, and at this point, how many people were at the banquet last night? Hold up your hand. Well, not that many. I was going to suggest if you arrange your jacket or your laptop bag on the table in front of you, when you're doing this and your hands slip out and your head bangs on the table, that will muffle it so the people next to you who are also trying to sleep won't be woken up. Any questions? Okay. How is this implemented? There are several programs available that will extract English strings, or I shouldn't say English, I should say original strings, because it's kind of, I would like to see original documents not be required to be in English. English should be one of the translated ones that could be possible. But the program that is used to extract those strings is ITS tool. That's the one we picked. There is another one from the Debian project called P04A, that's P04 anything. And that's an interesting thing which we will talk about here in a minute. But this ITS tool was written by Sean McCants of the GNOME project. It's recently, I mean it's not brand new, but it's recent and seems better supported and more standards aware and possibly standards compliant than others. It only works with XML files. So it will extract contents from XML files into a PO, it will put them back into, build a translated XML. And then also, like we said earlier, we use message merge and message format from the Gettext tools package. Now the interesting thing about this, ITS tool is in Python. We already had the Python interpreter as a dependency for something else in our doc chain, so we really didn't increase the size of dependencies there. And message merge and message format as part of Gettext tools are probably already installed on anybody's machine who has the doc toolchain. So it's really a very lightweight, it didn't add much to the doc toolchain we already had, which some people would claim is too large and probably is. But we didn't add it, we didn't make it worse. And now we get to the final, the meat of the thing, which is what was the result of this. I mean, it's all well and good to add stuff and have PO files and all that, but how does it work? Well, okay, this part's easy. Since August of 2015, we went live with this at the very end of August. It was like the last 2 or 3 days. We've had 11 new translations of articles and books into German, Dutch, Spanish, Chinese, and Korean. That would be up to the end of February, so in the last 6 months. And you look at that, or I look at that and go, okay, 11. Is that a lot? I don't know. And that turns out to be a fairly hard question to answer. How many new translations have been added to the FreeBSD documentation over the years? And it turned out to require a program. Incidentally, I love showing graphs in presentations because it's so PowerPointy. This required writing a shell script that went in and queried the version control system looking for new translations of existing documents that had been added over the years. It's from 2005, and that last bar is misleading because it's August 2015 to January 2016. Actually, February 2016, sorry. And so what you can see from this is, in absolute numbers, the tallest one is here at 17. Since 2009, we've had a downward trend. And the question then becomes, well, what caused that? I'd like to think it wasn't me personally. It could have been. Since 2009, and possibly before, we've had more commits, more changes to our documents, bigger changes. It's picked up. The amount of change is increasing. And in fact, in 2011 and 2014, you can see we had no new translations, which is bad. And in the last 2 or 3 years, I think it's even 2 years, we had translators say to us, translation teams in fact, we can't keep up with these changes. We just can't. Because, and they didn't say this, but the reason I see it as is it's just too much manual work. It's nonsensical. So, let's look at that very last bar on that graph. This is another PowerPointy thing. Remember 2014 had no new translations added? 2015 was going to be the same type of thing. This is August. These are all PO translations. We've had no new translations in the old system. So, we had a bunch added. Some of these were sample documents. We use our leap seconds article as an easy example of what the PO translation process is like. It's too soon to call this a trend. I wish I could. But I think what it does show is that with the PO translation system, we have the tools to make it possible to get back on track adding new translations. And that's what I really want to see. Incidentally, that last bar, if I recall correctly, was a Spanish translation of the FAQ, or FAQ, as some people say, which is a 30,000 word document. It's just amazing. That's serious effort, although a lot less effort than it would have been with the old method. All right, so it's not perfect, nothing is, and I prefer to call these things challenges. If you have a problem, you just have a problem. If you have a challenge, you are challenged to find a solution to it. And I'm hoping somebody can help me address some of these challenges. The first thing on here, these are in no particular order. We have things that should not be translated. They are the same in every language. And an example of that is we have a PGP keys article that contains the PGP keys of every FreeBSD developer. Hundreds. And of course the PGP key is a long list of numbers. It's the same. We want to be able to mark up our English original and say, hey, this thing, the translators don't need to even see this. When the translated version is generated, just bring these in, because they're the same in every language. Now you'd think, or I would think, that's a fairly common need in translation, right? There's bound to be something that should not be translated. Maybe trademarks, maybe something other than that. It turns out there is, well, I have been unable to locate a standardized way to handle this. I have had a couple people suggest on the DocBook mailing list that they had an external translation company. They provided their XML files, and they were told to mark them up a certain way, but they don't know what process was used after that. The best thing I've come up with is using XML processing instructions. Most of the things we don't want translated are represented by a single entity in a file. So it's just one little short thing, and we could put XML processing instructions on either side of it. But that's ugly in the tool chain. So if you've tried that or had a need for that and found a way that worked, or almost as importantly, a way that it should not be done, I would love to hear from you. Secondly, we have a pretty large amount of work in these existing translations. Some of them are really out of date. Some are almost up to date with the English version. But the PO system, the Gettext system, it's essentially a lookup table, right? You have the original string as the key, and then the translated string is what's returned as a result. There's a correspondence there. With our old translations, there is no correspondence. You have the translated file. There is no way to tell from that file which sections of it correspond to the English file. Or there isn't, at least as far as we know. There's an old program called XML2PO. That also was from the GNOME project. I say it GNOME because I've heard the GNOME guys say it both ways. That is it's a program that's supposed to be able to take your English XML file and your translated XML file and generate a PO file from those. And then you've got a PO file and you can go ahead with that. It assumes that the lines correspond one-to-one. And not only do we have rules, formatting rules for the English version of our XML documents about how you wrap lines and such, the translation teams have rules for that, and theirs are different than the English rules, and different from the other. Each language team has their own rules. So, like the German section that we showed earlier, there is no one-to-one line correspondence there, so we can't really generate a PO file from that. Well, I say that's a technical problem because if they're identical, the XML elements in there should match up, and so a reasonably smart program should be able to do that. I don't know of one. It sounds like this switching from a manual translation method to the PO system is kind of a one-time conversion, and people they just maybe just toss their old stuff and start from scratch with the PO system or another translation system. I would love to hear anything about matching those up. It seems to me like it would be a really interesting project for mid to high level college type stuff. If you need like a master's thesis, how to do language analysis and XML matchup to generate a PO file. Just plant seeds. Another problem is context. In that Spanish translation we saw, there's a word, cautions. It's a single line, a single string. The word is cautions. That's a title in that, section title in that article. And that's been translated into Spanish, precauciones, which I'm probably terribly pronouncing. The translator didn't see any context when they were translating that. They don't know what kind of cautions that was, because Gettext was originally meant for programs where you'd only have a single string. There was no other context. Whereas with documentation, the translator really could use being able to see the paragraph before and after that section. So they know what kind of cautions, because it may translate to a different word or several words. The PO editors that are available, that I've tried at least, generally don't show context. And I think that's a historical thing, because technically, in the PO file that is generated by ITS tool, there's a comment that tells the line number that that string came from. So it's easy to locate, so it's just a matter of the PO editor realizing that the translator could really stand to see that. And finally, more PO editors. The examples we showed were PO edit, which is like the lowest common denominator. There are others. In FreeBSD right now in ports, we have PO edit, G-translator, which is similar but uses, is it Qt? It's one of those big graphics toolkits that takes forever to build. But it's a pretty nice PO editor. And we also have localize, L-O-K, A-L-I-Z, and the K means it's KDE. So how many programs are in the ports tree? Install them all. It might not be that way. I have not tried it. We need more. And I say that for two reasons. One is that the BSD community has had 25 years to decide if VI or Emacs is the grand ultimate editor for everybody, and hasn't decided that. So I think a very similar situation might exist with PO editors. Some people just might find a particular editor to work better for them. The other thing is, I also strongly suspect that certain PO editors might work better for certain languages. The Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, the CJK languages, might work really well with one editor, and a different editor might work really well with, say, German and French. So we need more. And along those lines, there is a very well-regarded PO editor called Virtal, V-I-R-T-A-A-L. We have a port, or the beginnings of a port, thanks to Mark Felder, and it almost works, but it doesn't let you edit strings. Somebody who's into the Python GTK thing could probably fix it fairly quickly. I will have a link to that here in a bit. So that is what we have done so far. What could we do? And I look at that and say, man pages. I want a translation of every man page into every translated language we could. But remember, ITS tool only works on XML files. But remember back further that Debian P04A. P04A stands for anything. One of the formats one of the file types it supports is man pages, whatever. Man pages are supported by Debian's P04A. Haven't tested it. But that gives us the capacity to give up-to-date and complete translations for man pages. Right now for FreeBSD, we do have translations of some man pages into some languages. The most complete is the Japanese translation project. They've done a big thing. As far as I know, it's all manual translation. So they may not have all the man pages translated, and probably they have a hard time keeping it up to date because it's that same manual process, which is so much work. And I look at this and say, okay, if we can get new translators, like we have our Doc Lounge, new translator comes up and says, I would like to help. We could say, hey, you need to know 3 commands. And you can choose from any of these PO editors. Here's the one we normally use, but we can help you with these others. And you can begin translating. And maybe they won't take off. And if they stick around, some of our best documentation contributors do not speak English natively. And I don't think that's an accident, because in my experience, the people who speak English as a second language speak it better than native speakers. They have not forgotten the rules, and they care about being precise. So we have many, there's not a lot from every language, but we have many translators who go on to contribute to the original documents. And some of them then go on to become source committers or port people, and that's great. We're back to that Metcalfe's law, the feedback rule. More users means improving the project for everybody. Okay, we're almost done. What we learned. The value of cross-pollinating with other projects. It's really easy to look at other projects as competitors or rivals or sibling rivalry. But most of the work I've done on this PO stuff in the last 6 months was due to sitting in a conference room at BSDCan next to Ryan Lordy of the GNOME project and saying, hey, you know with those PO files, what happens when you do this? So, oh, we do this. We run this program. So, well, what about this situation? Oh, that. And then the talk started. And yet, that little bit of information from somebody who has used those tools is tremendously valuable. So my point here is, don't consider other projects to be rivals. Consider them gold mines of information. And if you ask them for help, most of the time, they will be flattered by that attention, by that acknowledgement that they're experts at what they're doing and that their situation is different than yours and you can both learn from each other. We learned about commit by commit porting. In the last couple of months, I believe it was, a question came up on the FreeBSD Xorg mailing list. We're working on getting the latest version of Xorg so we can use modern graphics boards. And we're looking at two methods of porting. We're looking at file by file or commit by commit. And I say, aha, commit by commit, that sounds familiar. Well, really, that is the old translation method we were using. People would port the English document to their translated version. And so we said, okay, well, here's the problems we found with that. You have to go in order. And for drivers and stuff, if there's some security problem that you'd really like to get in there right now, you might not be able to because you kind of have to go in the same order as the original commits. And there can be big commits that wipe out lots of work you've done, and a big commit can stall the whole thing because somebody has to wait until that big thing is done. And with a volunteer project, there's a huge single commit. People are kind of reluctant to take that on, so they can sit around for a while. Finally, these last three are one thing. Technical debt. Technical debt is when you get behind, basically. And we've had that. We've only been using DocBook XML for 3 years, 2 years now, 2.5, somewhere in there. Before that we had DocBook SGML, which had been abandoned by every other project in the world, I think. And it's not that we want to stick with old stuff, it's just that we have kind of that laid-back BSD thing of, well, it works, so why bother? Why change it? The problem with that is that you end up paying technical debt one way or another. You can pay it a little along the way by trying to keep up with things gradually, or you get to a point where there's something you need to do and you can't do it because your system is so outdated. So watch out for that. UTF-8 is part of that technical debt. We still use ISO 8859, Japanese uses EUC JP, is that, I think. There are other character sets in there that are in use. We really need to switch to UTF-8 for everything if possible, for everything we can if it can't be everything at all. And finally, XML techniques. That was not Our documents were written originally many years ago, and the style they used was, we used a single XML entity to include a chapter into another file. And when somebody says to you, I didn't know anybody still did it that way, that's a warning of technical debt right there. The modern way to do that is to use X-include. And the reason we should be looking at that is because somebody will come up with a tool and say, yeah, we know your files. I said, yeah. But that was somebody else pretending to say that. See, yes, your files are XML standards compliant, but our tool only supports X-include. That could happen to us. So we need to watch for that. And like I say, when somebody says, I didn't know anybody still did it that way, that's a warning sign. I want to thank all these people who all worked on this project, and there are many more than this They all put in a huge effort in various ways. And there, like I say, there were many more than this, but I can't remember who they were, or it was done before I was involved. So thank you to these people. All this stuff I've talked about here is at that URL. The PDF of the article that this presentation is about is there. The slides for this presentation are there. The script that extracts the information about what new translated files have been added is there. A spreadsheet of that output with a graph is there. The friendly text file of that is there. A CSV file of that is there. Links to translation mailing lists and the FTP document, PO editor chapter is there. And pretty much everything I could think of is there. So, who has questions? Who can help me with the things we don't want translated? Nobody?
How many document commuters know the new PO translation system?
I'll repeat that. How many documentation committers know the new translation system?
Yeah.
That's a good question. We publicized it some. Part of that is coming to here, and I'll be going to BSDCan and also promoting it. There's been a little reluctance on it because, I suspect, we've had these translation teams using the old method, and they've been using it for, let's say, 5 or 10 years. It doesn't seem that bad to them. They're kind of used to it. Whereas if they were coming in from an outside project, they would look at that and say, man, there's no way I'm doing that much work. We haven't had a lot of resistance to it. It's generally been received pretty well. And some of our translators had given up earlier. The Dutch team, they've translated a couple of articles using the PO system. And so the feedback from the people who've used it has generally been pretty positive. The big concern, or a big concern, is that context problem. So I might see a string and not know what it's related to. But in general terms, it's been pretty positive. And one thing we have to do is try and revitalize our translation system, our translation people. Because a lot of people have just kind of faded out over the years because it was so much work. It's perfectly understandable. It's more than understandable. I'm so impressed by the people who stuck it out and continue doing that because, man, that can't be fun. And most people who translate are doing it as volunteers. I appreciate that kind of commitment. So, in answer to that question, most of the documentation committers, I believe, are aware of it. Some have tried it, some have not. There haven't been any that have had ultra negative reactions to it. And the old translation method can still be used. This does not replace it. The old stuff is still there. Of course, they shouldn't be used on the same document. That doesn't work.
I think translation memory is important for this work. Do you have a plan to share the translation memory? For example, operating mastery is a new translation memory for the Dutch, Japanese, Chinese, Korean on the FreeBSD documentation page.
Okay, the question is, do we have a way to share that translation memory among translators or multiple members of a translation team? At present, we've been committing those PO files into the repository. And the PO file really is where your translation memory comes from. There are compendiums, they call them. I believe that's the right term. You can tell your PO editor to include files and generate, so it increases its translation memory. Or it could be as simple as we have a script that runs find and looks for all the PO files in a language directory of the tree and merges them all, or, well, just cats them together and feeds that into the translation memory system. Oh, and one thing I did forget to mention on that is one nice thing that translation memory can help with is some translation teams, like the German team, have a list of standard words. It's like, if you see this word or term, translate it to this, because that way we will have a consistent translation. And if that word or term is in your translation memory, it will come up So it kind of helps you that way. It helps standardize those terms. Anybody, any other questions? All right, thank you.